Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our 22nd year of Agenda Alexandria. My name's Frank Fannin, and I'm going to be the chairman of Agenda Alexandria this year. It's been great serving on the board for many years, and the way our organization works is we have lots of board members that make this happen. We have 15 board members to help prepare all these programs for Agenda Alexandria. And as I call your name, if you're a current board member, I appreciate you just waving and acknowledging yourself. Jenny Franco at the front desk, and we have Doug Murphy also over there. And then we have Jay Test and Val Hawkins back there by the bar, two of our board members. And we also have Florence King, who's here with us tonight, and our secretary, Linda App. So thank all of you for all your good work and getting this year started. And we're also fortunate to have Pat Miller as our new executive director. We've had Donna Walker-James for years, has served as our executive director, and she's done a wonderful job. And Donna, thank you for all your great service throughout the years with this organization. We always like to announce some of our elected officials and former elected officials that are in the room. I don't see we have any current elected officials here in the room tonight, but we do have former Mayor Allison Silverberg, former City Councilman Lonnie Rich, and Connie Ring, former City Council member and school board member. Three school board members, former school board members with us tonight, Henry Brooks, Mark Eaton, and Art Peabody. So thank you guys for being here. Okay. So we have a really good program in store tonight, and as many of you know, Alexandria is a very actively and civically engaged community, and the recent discussion that the City Council had last week on the Seminary Road issue really had a lot of people on both sides of the issue coming forward and expressing their opinions. And tonight we have an all-star panel that's going to be presented, and one of our newest board members, I'm going to call him up now, is Rod Kuckro, who's the former president of the Delray Civic Association, and Rod's also a career journalist. So Rod, we're going to turn the program over to you right now, and you can get it running with the war on cars. All right.
Right there. Hey, good evening. Welcome. Does this work? Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, man.
Yeah, okay, good. Thank you, Frank. As Frank mentioned, I'm a brand new member of this board, and I've been asked to moderate this, I think, very interesting session. Agenda Alexandria, as you know, a lot of you have been members for many, many years. It's all about bringing more light than heat to a subject, and we have a good panel this evening, I think, to help us get through this. The title of the session is Complete Streets or War on Cars. And we're not trying to be provocative there, but it got you here, didn't it? But the title's meant to sort of juxtapose two phenomena which are both real and that sometimes come into conflict. In the past 40 years, Alexandria has changed a bit. I'm sure a lot of you in the audience have been here that long to remember the fact that the urban core was really Old Town, but more and more the suburban neighborhoods in the city have been expanded, become more dense, and we've lost really any real sense of a suburban community. Say parts of Fairfax County we're much more of an urban neighborhood, an urban city now. Alexandria is the most densely populated jurisdiction in the state of Virginia, and we're among the top 15 most densely populated cities in the United States. That's just a fact. That reflects progress. It reflects our economic success. It reflects some good public policy on the part of our city leaders, but it also reflects the fact that that success has brought some conflict. I'll give you a little data to sort of just chew on. So in the year 2000, we had about 128,000 residents and about 101,000 cars. Between 2000 and 2010, we added about 11,700 people and about 6,500 cars. Between 2010, though, and 2019, today, we added just under 17,000 people, but almost 18,000 cars. So in other words, the policy of the city has an effect to try to do things like create road diets, require fewer parking spaces for new development, to try to restrict the use of automobiles, hasn't really achieved that goal. And in fact, over the past 30 years, the ratio of cars to people in the city has stayed about the same. It's been between 77% to where it is today at 80%. So in fact, there are actually more cars in the city now per resident than there were 20 years ago. And the city's been trying to deal with that, and one way they've been dealing with it is with these controversial road diets, but they're also they deal with it in terms of how they look at urban planning. And I think tonight we may discuss a lot, and what you may ask questions about is, as good as some of these ideas are there unintended consequences to these city policies? So without me going on anymore, I want to introduce our panel. I'm going to start here on my left, to your right. John Townsend has been for quite a few years the public face, really, of AAA Mid-Atlantic. He is I think the VP of Government Affairs and Public Affairs for AAA. I'm glad John could make it. Next to John is Jack Sullivan. Jack Sullivan is a longtime city resident. He's a former president of the Seminary Hills Civic Association. He's been on more boards and commissions in the city than I can count. Jack, thanks for making it. Next to Jack is Josephine Liu. Josephine is a member of the Alexandria Pedestrian and Bicycle Advisory Committee, which is an independent, citizen-led volunteer organization. It is not part of the city government. But it's a very clever name because it gets a lot of attention because it sounds like it is. And maybe we'll talk about that. But Josephine is their vice chair for bicyclists. And there's a vice chairman for pedestrians as well, right? And then on the end is Nate Maceck. Nate is a resident of Rosemont, or West Delray, as I like to call it. And he's chairman of our planning commission. So he brings a perspective to this discussion that goes beyond just transportation. For those of you that follow these things in the city, I think a lot of you are pretty wonky about this. The small area plans that are done in the city, there really are two major aspects to them. One is density and design and urban planning. The other one is transportation and how there's a nexus between the two. And so Nate's very familiar with that. So I welcome his attendance here. Thank you, all four of you. Let's give them a hand before they start, please. And if you haven't thought of it yourself yet, please silence your cell phone. I know a lot of you maybe want to be on the phone tweeting about what's going on here tonight, but the rings can be an interruption for the panelists. I want to start with a very simple question for each one of you. And I sort of gave you a heads up on this. The term complete streets, it was first coined in 2003. It's not a very new term. What does it mean to you? I mean, what is implied by complete streets? What's the program supposed to be about, Nate?
Well, I'll take that one first. And from my perspective, it means that we're thinking completely about how that right-of-way is used and all of the potential users of that, the people who are driving cars, the people who are walking, people who are biking, using alternative scooters and other modes that we now have. So from my perspective, Complete Streets is about thinking about the complete set of users of the street, of the public right-of-way, and that includes people who are driving in their cars, people who are biking, people who are walking, people who are using the new and emerging modes that we see in our streets, like scooters and other types of vehicles. Thinking about the distances that people need to travel when they're going about. Is it children walking to school? Is it people getting to work? Is it people trying to reach transit? Thinking about all those different user types and how we create a facility that works for all of them. And I think our paradigm in the past has been exclusively looking at it through the windshield, thinking about what works for automobiles, perhaps thinking about sidewalks, but thinking about all users and all types would be my definition.
So Nate, in terms of your work on the Planning Commission with the planning staff, how frequently does the Complete Streets sort of approach get factored into your month-to-month dockets? I mean, does that come up a lot more now than it used to as you look at development?
Is it compliant with the Complete Street sort of expectations that we have for adjacent development? Planning Commission isn't the commission that's responsible for defining streets and roads, and we have other commissions that would do that, like the Traffic and Parking Board and to some extent the Transportation Commission. So our own charge as a commission is more peripheral in terms of does an individual development contribute to the concept, but we're not out there implementing it on broad cloth on existing streets.
Josephine, I'm sure you've given this a lot of thought. What does complete streets mean to you?
I'd echo a lot of what Nate just said. I think about complete streets as being streets that are for everyone. And as Nate just pointed out, that's across all modes of transportation, regardless of whether people are driving or walking or biking or wheeling or scooting or whatever modes of transportation they choose to use. But that's also all ages. So children, adults, senior citizens, and also all abilities. So it's not just the able-bodied, but people who may have different ability and mobility challenges.
Okay, thanks. Jack.
Thank you. First of all, I want to say what an honor it is for me to be here. But I'm a little chagrined tonight because before I got here, someone said to me, what the heck do you know about transportation? And unfortunately, it was my wife. So, at any rate, what I think about complete streets is I wrote a letter to the Gazette Packet 5 years ago called Complete Streets or Complete Idiocy. And it had to do with the fact that the Duke Street Transportation Plan calls for a bike path to be built on the south side of that major artery, separated from street traffic and from pedestrian sidewalks. So you'd have a separate area for bikes and a separate area for pedestrians. It would seem like a good idea, but it requires condemning a strip of land, now all on private property, to construct the bike lane. The homeowners on that area of Duke, which stretches roughly from Jordan to Wheeler, are constantly facing the idea that one of these days the city's going to come down and try to get by eminent domain, take their front lawns. Now, if you've seen that, I have a picture of what their front lawns look like. They're mostly around 50 feet in depth. It would take about 20 feet of those front lawns, and that is considered complete streets. So that is why I said I think it is possibly complete idiocy.
All right. John, same question to you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Rod. Complete streets is a concept, as the first two panelists said, to reorient or redesign the streetscape in order to accommodate every user, irrespective of age, irrespective of ability or inability or disability, and irrespective of mode. Now, that's what it is on paper. But oftentimes, it doesn't work out that way. It gives pride of place to certain modes of transportation, and that becomes the inherent problem, because there's nothing inherently wrong with accommodating the streetscape to make them safer or to accommodate the maximum number of people, but it comes down to making choices. And those choices involve who is in and who's out. It's like drawing a circle and excluding certain people. And Rod used a term that we discussed on the phone, which is a war on cars. And while I have no real qualms about this, if there's an overwhelming or overarching traffic safety need, the only mode of transportation that is being excluded would be people who drive in cars. But the curious thing about that, as Rod also noted a moment ago, is that that group, not that it should have total sway, it shouldn't. The roads belong to everyone. That's a concept that AAA endorses universally. But what's happening is, in many communities across the country that have adopted complete streets, and even in Alexandria, the car, if you own a car, and many of you do, you are the low person on the totem pole. I heard a person in the district say this a couple of weeks ago at a meeting behind closed doors, and I shouldn't discuss this, but what she said was that as far as she was concerned, and she represented a certain constituency that's also represented on the stage, that the car has the lowest priority. And The streets should be redesigned with cyclists and pedestrians first. I can understand that sentiment from a traffic safety standpoint. But if you live in Alexandria, and all of you do, for the most part, and you're suffering from the ninth longest commute in the state of Maryland, and a commute that's longer than even the national average, then I think that if you have complete streets, it not only has to accommodate all modes of transportation, but it should also alleviate the number one irritant in our lives today, which is gridlock and congestion, and also solve the intractable problem of traffic safety. We have to make traffic safety our number one priority.
I hear what you're saying about people in cars feeling sometimes as if they're not getting the same consideration they used to. But let's face it, how many people here tonight came here in a car? How many people rode a bike? Cool, but it's like 80 to 3. But let's face it, I drove here. My car weighs a ton and a half, and I've got a lot of innate privilege on the road, whether I ask for it or not. And there are some people who have no alternative to that, but there are others who want to be able to blend into the same traffic patterns. So I'd like to get to that a little later on and ask you about what AAA may be doing as an organization to try to adapt to their own members' mindsets. I'm sure now a lot of your members not just have a car, but they may have a bike. They do. Or they may use a scooter. Jack, is there a war on cars, or is that just sort of empty rhetoric to sort of cater to people who think that they're not getting the same consideration that, say, Josephine's constituents are?
I don't really think there's necessarily a war on car. There's a very vocal, fanatic minority who are who want to get people out of their cars. They want to lower speed limits. They want to shrink the size of roads, and they're being heard in the towers of power, and that is a problem.
Josephine, from the standpoint of your committee and the people you know who really rely on their bicycles not just for leisure, to get to the store, to go to farmers markets, but to go to work, I mean, do you think this war on cars idea is really sort of a misconception of how things actually are?
I do. I don't think there's a war on cars. What I would characterize it as a war for more options. I do bike to work. I've biked to work pretty much every day for the last 5 years. I know a lot of other bike commuters who also bike year-round, and for us, it's a feasible mode of transportation. It's fun. It's fast. It's efficient. I'm much healthier because of it. I mean, frankly, I can say that I love my commute, and I don't think many drivers can say the same thing. I see sunsets over the monuments. I see sunrises over the river. I've seen bald eagles and turtles and ducklings on the trail. You just don't get those things from behind a windshield. And it's not just for me biking to work. It's biking to the library. It's biking to the grocery store. I bike to the theater. I bike to the symphony. I've even biked to the airport, and it is possible. And I'm not just an exception out there. The trails are getting busier and busier, and I think it's a great thing to see. And I think of someone like my mom who doesn't drive, doesn't bike. You know, she's pushing 70, so not exactly an early tech adopter. I haven't convinced her to use Uber or Lyft yet, but she does enjoy walking and she enjoys using public transportation. And so when she comes to visit me here, she has all those options. She can walk to the grocery store. She can walk to the pharmacy. She can walk to the King Street Metro and hop on the trolley and go shopping on King Street, or be in downtown DC and go visit all the museums. And in contrast, when she goes to visit my brother, who lives in a more car-centric suburb, she doesn't have those options. There are sidewalk gaps, so she can't walk safely to the grocery store. The bus stop is a half-mile away, and the bus stop is right next to lanes of traffic that are moving at 40 miles an hour. It's just not a very comfortable place to take transit. So she feels trapped when she goes to visit my brother. And I don't want anybody to feel trapped. I want everybody to have options.
Nate, same question.
I don't think that there's a war on cars. I mean, I do think that there's an intentional effort here to rebalance away from what was a very predominant focus on cars in our street designs and in our urban way of thinking about how to design a city. And we've tried to move the balance back towards greater consideration of the needs of people who are moving by foot or on transit or on bicycles, so that it's more balanced in its approach. But I don't think there's a war on cars.
How much of your perceptions that are very different have been formed by your observation that in terms of public policy, there's something missing? And I'm going to ask you to sort of address this, you first, John. I mean, are public policymakers at the state level, the local level, not explaining to the residents of a community enough, here's where we're going. Our community is changing. We're different than we were 10 years ago or 50 years ago, and we have to try new things to try to sort of stay current and pursue economic development, pursue new residents to sort of cater to sort of the way the world is changing. Is that one of the problems here, is that there's just not enough understanding on the part of the population?
Thank you. So this is going to sound a little strange. So the community is changing, but not changing in the way that some would say is changing. For example, I was at the Transportation Planning Board meeting last week, and they talked about how people commute in the so-called inner ring of the Washington metro area, which includes Alexandria. And they said that 30% of people in Alexandria, Arlington County, and the District of Columbia commute to work alone. So that number has dropped precipitously. But that's not true. So you go to the American Community Survey, conducted by the U.S. Census Bureau, where they ask people how they commute, and almost 68% of people, almost two-thirds of people who live in Alexandria drive to work alone. 21% catch mass transit, and another 8% carpool. Now, what I'm trying to say is, our view is that every modality and every mode should be served. But what Complete Streets does is to say to those who use a certain mode, we're going to try to reduce your mode to increase the modes of all others, and those modes have not really increased substantially over the last decade or so. The big game changer in the Washington metro area, although we spend billions of dollars adding additional mileage for metro, we've added more lane mileage, and we've solved some tremendous traffic bottlenecks in the region, including the Spaghetti Junction or the Mixing Bowl. But the fact of the matter is, the one thing that made the biggest paradigm shift in the commute in the Washington metro area and why fewer people are driving is because of the federal government and local governments and state governments and some enterprising employers that are allowing their workers to telework or telecommute at least one day a week. That has been the biggest game changer. But don't believe the hype. Yes, there are more people cycling. Yes, there are more people walking. But by far, the mode of transportation used by most people in Alexandria and in every other part of the Washington metro area is by car. Now, how do we change that? And do we spend billions of dollars doing it, but to what end? So someone broached the subject a moment ago about lowering the speed limit to 15 in Alexandria across the board. They've talked about doing the same thing in the District of Columbia. But I've said, and this is a AAA position, while it sounds good in theory and while it sounds good on paper of lowering the speed limit, because if I'm hit by a car, by a person going 15 miles per hour, my chances of survival are 85 to 90% versus if I get hit by a car going 40 miles per hour, my chances of survival are very, very limited, down to about 50% or 60%. The fact of the matter is, but you have to consider every aspect of traffic safety. And by that I mean, if you lower the speed limit across the board, what will drivers do? It leads to more road rage, it leads to more aggression behind the wheel, it leads to more reckless driving and more speeding. I saw it this morning coming into the city from a meeting, and it was a funeral procession. We live in a place now where they don't even, people got angry because these people were going through an intersection with the lights on and with funeral flags, and people bomb rush them in the intersection. That's how irritated people are, because they have to grapple with, day in and day out, the third worst commute in the entire nation. That's not an excuse. It's reality.
John, I want to follow up. And you mentioned earlier in your answer that money is not a way to solve this issue. You mentioned throwing billions of dollars at trying to. It seems as if, and I want the rest of you to sort of think about this question too, that this is more about sort of changing behavior and almost common courtesy. But to what degree? I mean, how does AAA, when you lobby a lot, you've got your fingers in legislation in these jurisdictions. You do surveys about what the law should be about texting and driving and speed limits. I mean, how much of this comes down to sort of the very difficult work of government of trying to change generationally the behaviors of people who may not want to have their behaviors changed?
You need tougher laws, more stringent punishment, and greater enforcement. Greater enforcement. And then all of us individually and collectively needs to adopt a traffic safety culture. 90% of all traffic fatalities and 95% of all traffic crashes are caused by human error. To err is human, the poet once said. But the fact of the matter is we make too many mistakes every day behind the wheel. And in order to inculcate traffic safety, it behooves each one of us to say, no matter what mode of transportation I use, I am going to exercise the doctrine and follow the doctrine of proper outlook. In other words, if I'm a pedestrian, I am going to exercise that. I'm going to watch out for myself and watch out for my fellow man. If I'm a cyclist, the same thing. I want to make sure if I'm a pedestrian rather, if I'm crossing the street, I make eye contact with the driver first before presuming to walk out. If I'm another driver, I'm not going to text behind the wheel. I'm not going to speed. I'm going to obey each and every safety and traffic rule. That is what a traffic safety culture is. But unfortunately, a third of all fatalities in this country and this region are caused by drunk drivers. Another third are caused by people who don't obey the speed limit. And another third are caused by people who spend too much time on their telephones behind the wheel. That's the most pernicious problem we have, by the way.
Thanks, John. Nate, I want to ask you to answer this, almost the same question from your point of view as a land use planner. When we met last week, we talked about the interface between parking policy and land use, and of course parking is all about cars. So over the past few years, the city has adopted new standards for residential and commercial parking. Most notably, a year or two ago, any new restaurant in the city needs not provide parking. Yet they want customers, but they don't have to provide parking any longer. So what's the rationale for those changes? And so how are those decisions reached? And to what degree is that the Planning Commission and then the City Council subsequently trying once again to change behavior by discouraging automobiles in certain places, or maybe even if a new townhouse is built, the parking requirement is reduced, and so therefore you are allowed to bring fewer cars to the city. I mean, what's the public policy reason behind that? And in your view, will it work over time, or is it simply a matter of waiting and seeing? And if it didn't work, would you go back and amend those rules to say, maybe we have to provide some parking for businesses that want to have customers?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm going to correct one point you made there, which is that restaurants don't have to provide parking. They under certain circumstances, they still do. It's that we've switched from a standard that's based on the number of seats that a restaurant has to the number of square feet that the restaurant occupies. And there are some instances where a restaurant may be so small in terms of its square footage that it wouldn't have to provide parking. But it really depends on the circumstance of the size of the restaurant. And importantly, one of the things with our new standards is that they're tied to accessibility to metro and to transit and to walkability. Because what our studies have shown, the standards were based on a detailed study of use across the city and what people were actually demanding in the way of parking. for different commercial uses. We did a similar study a few years before that on residential uses, which is driving how much, no pun intended, which is driving how much is needed for the parking for apartments and for other multifamily residences within the city. One of the things that our studies found, and in disclosure, I served as chair of the task force that looked at the new parking standards. That was something that came through both the Transportation Commission, which I was on at one point, and the Planning Commission, and passed with my support in both of those bodies. One of the things that we looked at was what people were actually demanding in terms of parking and what people were using at restaurants and at commercial office buildings and at other uses throughout the city. And what we found was that people weren't using the parking that we were requiring people to build, which adds a really extensive cost when you're asking developers to put that parking underground. We have cases where there's, half the parking that was built is not being used on a daily basis by those developments. An example would be the Saul Center, which is where the Trader Joe's is on North Washington Street. The Harris Teeter, a couple blocks from there, is another case where that development was required to build another half floor of parking as part of that approval. And there's a whole, basically half floor of residential parking underneath that building that's completely unused. That grocery store went through a case where they had to put some sealant down on their floor, and they closed about 20% of the parking at one time to go sequentially through the parking garage and put the new sealant in place. And while they were doing that, there was absolutely no impact on your ability to find a parking space in that garage because we required them to build way more than they really needed as part of their development. So the standards were really looking at not just trying to channel behaviors in a new direction. It was really saying, what are we demanding and what should we be requiring people to build based on what the revealed preferences of drivers? How much are people demanding in the way of parking? Let's make that the standard for what people have to provide.
Thanks. Jack, I bet you have a different point of view on this. You've been involved in some land use battles over the years. To what degree is providing parking with development really something that has to be considered anymore? If Nate's right, and if Josephine's right, that more people are finding different ways to sort of live, that maybe people who live in that building Nate's referring to, they don't have a car at all because they take a bus to Metro and they bike down to Old Town to go to dinner.
The question of parking downtown is one, it seems to me, that is very important from an economic standpoint. I'm not sure how many of you relish an attempt to eat at one of our excellent restaurants downtown and then say to yourself, well, where are we going to park? And that is always an issue. I have always felt that a restaurant that was willing to pay for, or even for a modest amount, to let parking by some attendant out in front is a good idea. And I'm sure that the people who live in the houses where they park the cars aren't as excited about it as I am. But it seems to me that there are other options for getting a car downtown and being able to enjoy yourself at a local restaurant.
Can I say something to this?
Brief.
Yes. Okay, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Answer. Add to it. No, go ahead.
No, I was about to talk about this whole concept of what I call jettison parking minimums, which is what's happening across the country in the District of Columbia and in Alexandria. And these are cookie-cutter approaches to urban planning now. But so they go in and they do these studies and they say, well, I drove past Harris Teeter or by Walmart and I noticed that on a Wednesday afternoon at 7:30 or evening, there are only 40% of the cars, parking slots being used. The fact of the matter is that Walmart or Harris Teeter does not build their parking lot to accommodate the Wednesday night traffic. They build it to accommodate the crowd that needs to get in there on Thanksgiving and for Christmas shopping. And that's what the urban planners don't. They don't understand how real people live. That's the problem. Because they've been in all these college campuses smoking grass and sitting in the grass, and they don't understand the real world anymore. And so that's what it really comes down to. Let me say this. I spent 11 years in the mayor's office in Lexington, Kentucky, which is about twice the size of the population here in Alexandria. And in Lexington, we consider parking to be a public good. What's happening in cities now, it is a public asset. So you charge to the hilt for it, because to do otherwise is foolishness, they say.
Hey, I'd
So-
like to respond to that momentarily, just to say that I would say our study in Alexandria was not a cookie-cutter approach, that it was informed by studies that looked at different times of the day and was really trying to look around the clock, around the week, at different demands. One other thing that the last comment implied was that the city was doing this because it was trying to reduce what Harris Teeter or Walmart or any other, well, we don't have a Walmart in the city, but what someone might be required to provide. And what I would note is that those applicants, the developer who's building for Harris Teeter is the one who's saying, you're making me build too much parking. It's Harris Teeter itself that's saying, we don't need as much parking as you're saying we should have. And that's why before we had all these changes, all of the reductions were required. So, and if they felt like they needed more parking to serve their Thanksgiving demand or whatever high demand situation you're talking about, in Alexandria they have that ability as part of their development approval to ask for that. So we're not saying you can't do that, but here's what the standards say should be provided, and there are ways for them to sort of tailor the approach to what they need as a builder.
Thanks, Nate. I'm getting some good questions from the audience, by the way. You have Post-it note pads, and if you want to set up a question, please do. After you're the members, we're having this for you, so you should be asking the questions as well as I. I want to ask you a question, Josephine. That's sort of an amalgam of two questions that are here. One is, sort of what would your group's opinion be on lowering speed limits in the city to something less than what they are now on residential streets and thoroughfares? This writer says we spend much more time driving and not being productive. To better our economy, we need to move people faster on our roads, not actually slow things down. So from the standpoint of your committee, would you support seeing the speed limits reduced? I think you're good.
I should have added one caveat at the beginning, which is that I am a volunteer for BPAC and I volunteer at other organizations as well, but I'm here just to represent my own personal opinions.
Okay.
And so I don't know that in BPAC we have discussed lowering the speed limits. I know we have discussed speed enforcement, and I think that is an issue that most people are aware of and know that, as I think John already mentioned, if a driver hits somebody at 20 miles an hour versus 40 miles an hour, the consequences for the person who is hit are much more severe. The person being hit has about a 90% chance of dying in the 40 mile per hour scenario. And so 40 miles per hour on many of our city streets is just not safe. One of the things that, so even on, I think our maximum speed limit on some of our streets is 35 miles per hour, but I think as I'm a driver as well, I have a car, I think we all know that most people are not driving at the speed limit. I look at Maryland, for example, and they have automated speed cameras in school zones, and the local jurisdictions are allowed to request it if they see that there is a need. It would be great to see something similar in Virginia, which currently does not allow automated speed enforcement at all.
This question is really set up your alley too, and I'll ask it because one of our members submitted it. So how would you suggest that users of the roads other than cars, I think we're talking about bikes and scooters, contribute to the cost of construction and maintenance of roads and policing of them? In other words, people pay gasoline taxes. Anybody who lives in the city, of course, pays property tax too, but I mean, it seems like there's no financial buy-in on the part of people who sort of advocate for a bike culture.
I'm not sure I'd agree with that. I mean, like I said, I do have a car.
I'm not sure I agree with it either. I'm just asking you the question.
I'm a longstanding member of AAA. I've had to call John's organization when my car battery died because I wasn't using the car enough. So every time I hop in every time I get on my bike instead of using my car, I'm not putting as much wear and tear on the roads, so maybe that's one fewer pothole come wintertime. contributing to fewer greenhouse gas emissions because I'm not paying for the gas and I'm not using it. No tailpipe emissions coming from my bike. I mean, if we talked about Trader Joe's earlier and the parking requirements there. I mean, I've seen situations where the parking is kind of precarious and drivers are trying to circle around the parking lot looking for space. There's protected bike parking underneath that same garage. I can just ride my bike right there. That's one more space for someone else to use in that parking lot. So I think I would say that because we are a growing city, as Rod mentioned at the beginning of his remarks, more people are moving in the city because it is attractive. So we have to figure out a way to fit more people and enable them to get around the city without taking up quite as much space. And I think that's more possible when people are on bikes or walking or taking transit. If we try to fit more cars onto the same road space, that's just going to lead to more congestion.
Okay, thanks, Josephine. We have a number of questions that relate to sort of commuter traffic that cut through the city from Fairfax County to go to Skyline or Fairfax County to go to the district or Arlington. And I wasn't able to get any data from the city that was definitive on how many people drive through, but we all know that happens because rush hours are rush hours by definition for what they're called. But there's another aspect to cut through traffic which Councilman Chapman made a very eloquent point of describing last Saturday at the public hearing on the road diet on Seminary Road when he talked about the fact that when you have a road diet, human nature is such that people can't move as fast as they want to in those 2 lanes on Seminary Road as they could on 4 lanes, are going to cut through the residential streets. And they're going to use an app like Waze to find a way to weave their way through the neighborhoods to get to their eventual destination, probably outside the city. So would one of you like to opine on what can be done to sort of curtail that, or should it be curtailed? I mean, one questioner asks, why not just prohibit through traffic on residential streets entirely, or require some type of easy pass tolling for people who want to use Route 1 to get to the city, or use part of Seminary Road if they're not a resident of the city? Would that work? John, have you ever heard of this kind of thing?
I frankly don't know if it will work. I don't know. Jack?
Rod, the statistics, there were statistics developed by what's called the Mid-City Study that Seminary Hill was a very important part of. And it came up with a statistic that 42% of the traffic that comes through our neighborhoods in the West End daily is cut-through traffic. And the answer to it is not easy. There have been proposals that this app Waze that they be shut off. There really isn't any answer for that 42% that comes through our neighborhoods in the AM and in the PM, and the fact that the people in that some of our city council in their wisdom decided to make Seminary Road 3 lanes instead of 4 is not going to help the situation. It's going to exacerbate it. Also, the Seminary Road is now the outlet for the new hot lanes. And the amount of additional traffic that is being predicted for that would take Seminary Road well over the maximum that the University of Michigan study, or was it Michigan State? And whatever, the Michigan study that said that if you have more than 20,000 people on a highway, that reducing the size does not work and causes rather severe delays and more accidents than it would be if it were left at 4 lanes.
Thanks, Jack. There are a lot of people asking questions or making statements actually about how difficult it is from them personally as a business owner or someone who wants to patronize a business, particularly in Old Town, to find parking. There are a lot of those complaints. There's also, I hate to say this, Josephine, a number of people have written about Simple question. How do you plan to convince bikers to stop at stop signs? I even see them to go through stop signs with their child, following them on a bike. And I talked to, obviously, Jim Doran, the chairman of your committee, about this the other day at breakfast, and he said that you all actually have an education program to try to get the scofflaws in the bike community to sort of understand that the laws apply to them the same as they do apply to cars. But this is an irritant to people. And is there any kind of PR campaign or marketing or outreach on the part of the bicycling community that can help, gain a little more understanding among drivers? Because after all, a lot of drivers run stop signs too. So what are you doing about that? And maybe, John, if you want to briefly talk about sort of AAA as well, I mean, what are you doing to try to educate your drivers on trying to obey the law more? Josephine, why don't you go first?
That is a great question. I agree with you. I'm always dismayed when I see a person on a bike running a stop sign. So here are just some of the things that I'm doing. First of all, as you just alluded to, Rod, we're running a bike mentoring program through BPAC, and what we do there is pair less experienced cyclists with more experienced cyclists who can help them find safe routes and educate them about traffic safety. I always work with my mentees, and I emphasize the importance of being a pal, and that's being predictable, alert, and lawful. And yes, that does include stopping at stop signs. And I encourage all of my mentors to tell that to their mentees as well. So that's just one thing. Second thing is I organize a lot of group rides, volunteer at group rides as well, and we always talk about road safety when we're doing our group rides, and we demonstrate that. Third thing I do is I try to be a good example when I'm on the road, and that is regardless of whether I'm biking or driving or walking, I try to make sure I obey all the traffic laws. Fourth thing, I'm a certified safety instructor, and so I teach classes around Alexandria and throughout the region through the Washington Area Bicyclist Association. And yes, we do talk about traffic safety there too, including stopping at stop signs. And then one more thing I'll mention is that BPAC is very active in biking in the schools and teaching kids how to ride, and then also running bike rodeo programs where kids can practice their traffic safety and bike handling skills in a safe environment like a park or a parking lot. And I often will actually run the intersection station where we set up a little intersection with child-sized crosswalks and child-sized stop signs, and we have them practice go through the intersection. We often have a local Boy Scout or a local police officer pretend to be a car or a pedestrian going through that intersection. If you've ever seen a police officer carrying a little sign with a cartoon car on the front, pretending to be a car, it's the cutest thing you've ever seen. So we make sure that the kids, who are the next generation of Alexandrians, know that, yes, they need to obey the traffic laws too. Does that answer your question?
Thoroughly, but don't go. Do you have any data on sort of the number of bicyclists there are in the city who actually commute to work? I mean, the city doesn't keep data on that anymore because people don't register their bike with the city, so we don't know how many bikes there are at any one time. Plus, you have bike share programs now. But do you have any sense of if this is a sort of a steady population of bicyclists, or is it growing, or are the things that people here complain about they're observing? It's some fellow lives down near Mount Vernon who's trying to get into D.C. for work, and he doesn't care about Alexandria laws or the work you do.
I think there's a number of sources of data. The ACS study that John just referenced is one of them. There are trail counters on many of our major trails in Alexandria and on our bike lanes, and they show increasing numbers of people using them, not necessarily for work, but also running errands and just using them for transportation. There's a whole bunch of surveys being run by different groups. So I can't quote you any numbers offhand, but I know that anecdotally the numbers are increasing. I see that every day. The one other thing I would add about stopping at stop signs and other traffic things is that it's a really hard problem. I mean, I'm doing what I can, but if anybody has suggestions for how to make that better, please come and talk to me afterwards.
Thank you. John, I want you to answer the same question, but from a different angle. Because I know you talk to the law enforcement a lot. We didn't invite somebody here tonight from the police department because it would have been a cumbersome panel, but I've talked to police in the city, maybe some of you have too, and they'll go after someone's car driving through a stop sign or a red light just like that, and you're not going to be able to explain your way out of it. But a lot of policemen have told me, well, it's just a stop sign, a guy on a bike, and there's nobody there, so you want me to give him a ticket? And I'll say, yeah. So the police, in your view, AAA's view, treat automobiles different than they treat bicyclists? And if so, what can be done about that? The other thing we talked about, you and I, before this session, is that Some jurisdictions have red light cameras, some have speeding cameras. Do red light cameras pick up bicyclists as well as automobiles? I've been asked that question before.
Okay, thank you. To answer the first question, we think everyone should stop for traffic signs and signals. I was in traffic court last week, not for myself, but because someone had gotten them. I'm like, Joe, I don't get tickets. Now, the minute I say that, I just curse myself, right? So tomorrow I get a ticket for the first time in 10 years or 15. All right, but at any rate, I was in traffic court last week in the district because someone had gotten a stop sign camera ticket. And the guy swore up and down that he did not run the stop sign. So when I walked into traffic adjudication, the lady behind the counter said, "You're the AAA guy, aren't you?" And she did us a courtesy. She showed us the video of the guy, and he ran the stop sign badly. And what most drivers do, they hit the brakes and they think they have stopped, but they haven't. They make a rolling stop or a California stop. And that happens far too often. It's one of the leading causes of traffic crashes in this country. It's a scourge on our highways. A third of drivers run through stop signs in the past 30 days in school zones where your kids and your grandkids are walking to and from school. It's dangerous because of where the stop signs are located. And we think that everyone who uses the highway should abide by traffic rules to send a message that we take traffic safety seriously in this country.
But the question was, just with all due respect, whether or not you think police enforce the laws differently, the same traffic laws on drivers of cars or operators of bicycles.
I don't know.
Here's another interesting question someone posed. I'm going to ask because I don't know who has the answer up here, but it's another sort of stab at sort of social engineering. Why not pay people to carpool just the way some businesses subsidize metro ridership, and some businesses like my company also subsidize parking? I mean, is that something that's just way too out there? John, have you heard of that? I mean, Nate, go ahead.
Well, I think the concept of what people pay is very interesting, and whether pay has consequences. You know, one of your earlier commenters said, should we put tolls on our streets and roads in order to help manage traffic? And it's true that once you put a fee on something, people will treat it differently. We all probably use a lot less water in our homes because we're charged by the 1,000 gallon per month for all the water that we might use. And if it were an unlimited resource, we might treat it differently. So pricing does matter. That, you know, whether we would ever have the ability to toll streets and roads, you know, we don't need to debate that here tonight because I think it's beyond the political reality. But one of the things that we do price is parking. And one of the things that we see is that we've adopted a policy as a city that now, instead of allowing free parking in residential areas adjacent to Old Town, there's now an ability or a requirement that people pay to park in those neighborhoods. So by doing that, we disincentivized people from grabbing the free spots right in front of someone's house, and instead, if they've got to pay, maybe they'll be more inclined to go into a garage or to pay to park on King Street rather than to take the free spot that's going to compete with residential parking. So I think pricing does have consequences, and we see that it changes behaviors, and we've seen changes in availability of on-street parking in Alexandria, where the on-street parking pilot was extended and made permanent in parts of Old Town because it had such a large quality of life impact for people in those neighborhoods. And I think if we can get creative about other mechanisms where we use pricing to channel behaviors, we can start to address some of the issues we want to challenge.
Nate, thank you, but don't go away. I want to follow up with that because, as we know, Old Town has residential parking permit program to try to protect the ability of residents to park near their homes. In a place like Del Rey, is that something, or even in Rosemont, that should be considered? And would it be advisable for the city to sort of do that as a gesture of goodwill towards people who live there? Because as you say, you guys aren't creating more parking spaces, so the only available spaces are on streets in front of people's homes.
Yeah, I think that's something we need to consider. And parts of Rosemont do have permit parking because it's adjacent to both the King Street and the Braddock Road Metro. So we do have outside of Old Town places that do have residential parking permit programs. I think it's only fair that if there's that we provide people who are dependent on-street parking for their residences the equal opportunity to have access to those spaces. And one of the reasons we have on-street residential parking permit programs is because we want people who are visiting, sure, we'll share the spaces with you, but we don't want you to park all day. We need you to turn over. There's a rationale there for making effective use of the space, but also providing enough of a push so that someone will move on and that resident can come home after work and find a spot. So I think we need to consider if there are issues in other neighborhoods where people aren't turning over enough and pricing or residential permits could help to provide a leg up. I think we should do it. Personally, I don't support resident-only parking because I think that makes poor use of a resource because then visitors aren't allowed to use it. It makes it challenging for people who have visitors because they've got to deal with permits and other things. So I would not personally support moving in that direction, but I think extending permits to other areas where there's high demand for on-street parking is something we should be looking at. And I think some of the change in parking policies that the city's talking about would make it easier to institute new districts where there is high demand for on-street.
Thanks, Nate. This is now the only microphone that's working, so the rest of you are going to come up here to give an answer. It's a little after 8:15. My goal was to end this at 8:30 so you can all get back to the rest of your lives, and that's going to be my aim here. I want to say I've got like 25 questions. A lot of them are better asked of someone who's not on the panel, frankly, someone like the mayor or the police chief. So if your question wasn't asked and answered, write somebody on the city's website and see if you can get an answer from them. But one thing I can tell you, I know a lot of you out there, there's a lot of frustration, there's a lot of anger, there's some very radical things being proposed in these questions that have to do with sort of just making the city just for us and not for anybody else. And that sentiment's understandable. But as I mentioned in my opening remarks, oftentimes these good ideas, the best laid plans often go awry because people don't think of unintended consequences. And part of, I think, where there are sort of gaps in agreement between, say, maybe Josephine's group and AAA is because there's not enough efforts to do outreach, or for the side that prevails in something like the road diet, to then push the city to deal with unintended consequences, say, of cut-through traffic on a neighborhood street. So I'd like you to each address, if you were king or mayor, and you wanted to propose something that would help sort of bridge sort of a lack of understanding or appreciation of one side in this debate for the other, what would that be? What could be done? John, I'm going to ask you to tackle that first because you probably have experience doing this in other jurisdictions around the DMV, and maybe there have been some sort of best practices instituted that we could learn from. So, give me about 3 minutes so I can get everybody in. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. I just think that what we need is a common sense approach to urban development, to city planning, and to respect everyone, especially those people who are property owners, and to understand that everybody can't live close to Metro. And that becomes this template, that becomes the paradigm for all the planning that we do. But at the same time, we have to face reality too. So since 2000, in the last 3 years in Alexandria, 13 people have died in traffic crashes. More than half of those persons, 7, were pedestrians. At the same time, the number of traffic tickets has declined in Alexandria, and the number of traffic crashes has declined by almost 25% from 2 years ago. So there has been remarkable progress in the city, but there's much work to be done. But the one-size-fits-all approach of urban planning that comes out of California first and the West Coast, goes to the District of Columbia, and then we try to make it fit in Alexandria. I think we have to listen to the residents. Not only people who ride bicycles, but people who are longtime residents. Everyone has a stake traffic safety and improving our commute are not two conflicting things. We have to balance both of them.
Thank you, John. Jack, do you want, if you have nothing to say, you can sit there.
I am going on 70 years that I've had a driver's license. And in those days, and I would take John's comments that ideas come out that may have application one place but another. The big idea when I was first driving was 3-lane highways. And that was because the big deal was passing Farmer Brown on the road because his hay rake was in front of you and you would go very slowly behind him and it would pile up 8, 9, 10 cars. So they decided 3 lanes was the perfect way to do it. You would go around that guy. What they forgot was that there's somebody coming the other way and he wants to get by Farmer Green and they're going to meet windshield to windshield. It proved to be the most dangerous way to run a road. And you will not find any 3-lane roads in the United States as major highways anymore. But we just created one in Seminary Road. We created one, and again, showing you that stupid old ideas can be coming around a second time. And the idea was that the center lane would be for emergency vehicles coming probably from east to west to the Inova Hospital, and that lane would be open. However, there's no provision that somebody can't be going from west to east on that same road, that same lane. They've pulled out on that same lane. There's no, unless they build some platform, it's going to be the same thing. So the 3-lane road is back with us and is in our own neighborhood. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. So Josephine, if you were alone in a room with a bunch of 10 angry drivers, and I can introduce you to 10 of them right here, sort of how would you win them over to help them understand, what the bicycle community is doing to try to actually not just, incorporate themselves peacefully into the fabric of Alexandria transportation, but try to make it better? I mean, what?
Sure. So I think one important thing to keep in mind is that it's not just the bicycle. Our name literally says it. It's not just bicycles. It's Bicycles and Pedestrian Advisory Committee. So one of the things I would invite everybody to do is come do a walk audit with us. We've done walk audits where we will walk for like the half mile around a local school and identify all the issues that kids confront every day when they're trying to walk to school. Maybe there's no sidewalk. Maybe the street's really busy and unsafe to cross because the cars are moving so fast. Maybe they need a little bulb out to make the corners safer at the crossings and they have a shorter distance to cross on the street. Maybe there's a sidewalk gap where they have to cross the street multiple times just to go down a block. I mean, there are so many issues for pedestrians in our city, and I would invite all of you to come walk with us, seriously. That saying, walk a mile in somebody's shoes. I think if we all thought about how other people get around in this city, including our kids, we might have a better understanding of why the city needs to work for all of us.
So Josephine, I understand people can volunteer through your website, right?
Yes, feel free to contact us through our website or alexandriabpac@gmail.com.
So what Josephine suggested is maybe you might want to volunteer to help sort of improve pedestrian access around parts of the city. But I learned from Jim Durham, the chairman of your committee, that you also have volunteers, and they're bicyclists, who will do sort of like, I would call them spot audits of traffic in places like Old Town, and they'll stand there during rush hour and they'll do counts of people who are running stop signs, both cars and bicycles. So you need volunteers for that too, right? I mean, in other words, people here who are worried about this or agitated about it can actually get involved and help do those counts and give those counts to the police, right? That's okay. Good. Nate, you want to wrap this up? We have a question here on scooters. Boy, I wish you'd been here in June. We had 100 people in this room, and nobody came here that day via scooter, by the way. But so we'll have to pass on that question. But Nate, you're the person who's here in public policy. What can be done to sort of bridge these two ways of thinking about urban planning and transportation?
Well, first, I would just touch on a couple of points that a couple of the other speakers have made, and enforcement's really important here. And that, in all the parking groups that I've served on, the one recommendation that everybody in the room could agree on was the importance of enforcement, and the feeling that there just wasn't enough being done with respect to, we were focused more on parking enforcement, but even among business owners, you'd say, well, I don't really care if they do great enforcement of parking because I don't want my customers to get tickets. Even they felt like there was a need for better enforcement of parking in Old Town. So I think that goes across the board, that people feel like we would have the behaviors we want and expect if we had better enforcement as a city. And so that's important. I think engineering is also important. I think, with respect to some of the new designs for streets and roads, I think, we have examples of this. King Street, for example, became a 3-lane street from Janney's Lane to approximately T.C. Williams High School, and has heavy traffic, but it works. And it had 4 lanes. Now it has 3 lanes. The center lane, it's a left turn lane, so I think that is not quite the design that we might have had a long time ago, but is really a design that when it's limited to turn movements or emergency vehicles seems to work, and we have them on Duke Street and King Street and other places in the city without incident. So the engineering challenges can be addressed, and I think there are good ways of doing that, and we're doing a lot of that. The other thing I'd say is that the reason I think that a lot of people feel strongly about creating urban environments that really in some ways feel like they minimize the automobile, it's that at the end of the day, when we're talking about where we park our cars or drive our cars, they're soul deadening places. Nobody wants to go spend time in the parking lot at Landmark Mall, which arguably has the most parking of anywhere in the city. We want to spend our time in those places where the parking is hidden away or the parking is not in our face. We want those environments. The places we want are the places that don't have the parking that's quite as visible to us. Does that mean we need to have options where we can park nearby or have other means to get there? Yeah, that's true. And the studies show that we've got, in Old Town in particular, every time this has been studied, the supply is there. The willingness for people to pay isn't always there. So that's part of it, is people, it's not the lack of parking, it's the lack of free parking that really is what irritates people. And I think if we create a circumstance where, people understand that there's a cost and there's, if you want free parking, it's available, but you've got to walk. If you are willing to pay a little bit, you can get a little bit closer. I think we'll be fine. And I think that those places that really create welcoming urban environments that are fun places to be, like the recent parking lot that we converted into a park at the foot of King Street, really will make us shine as a city and really be the sort of features that make this the place that people want to live. So I think that parking's important, streets and roads are important, but they are a means to an end, and we need to make sure we're putting that end, keeping that in mind in terms of the means of how we get there.
Thank you, Nate. There's so much we haven't gotten to tonight that touch on this topic. We haven't talked about what the role of Lyft and Uber is in sort of helping people navigate complete streets by not driving themselves. We haven't talked about something that's going to come down the pike in the next few years. That's driverless cars. How will they fit into the complete street model? What will the city do to regulate them? Will we be ahead of the curve or behind the curve as we have been on scooters? So there's a lot I think we discussed here tonight. Raise your hand if you learned something new, something worth taking to tell a neighbor, or just you? Oh, okay, good. Thank you. I hope there's some good food for thought, something you can take home, talk to your family members, your neighbors, people you work with, people you go to church with, because these issues are not going to go away. So on behalf of Agenda Alexandria, I thank you all for coming. Sorry about the technical glitches, but you know what? We're doing the best we can, and it's going to get better next month, I can guarantee you. And I hope you'll come back for another program. So thank you very much. Before we end, I want to, first of all, yes, give our panelists a round of applause. And our chairman, Frank Fannin, has some parting remarks.
Okay, thank you so much, Rod. Great job moderating, and thank you, panel, for being here. Very lively discussion, and we appreciate it immensely. So I want to thank all of you for being here tonight, and as Rod said, thank you for your patience with the technical difficulties. We're going to get that worked out. It's not going to happen when you all come back here in 5 weeks for our next meeting on October 28th. We're going to be talking about the school system and the overcrowding issues that we're dealing with here in Alexandria. So we hope all of you will be back here in 5 weeks for that. One thing I didn't do earlier, I'm going to do right now very briefly. I'm going to thank our sponsors. So let's hear it for Jen Walker, who's our high dollar sponsor for Agenda Alexandria this year. Her and Simpson Development are the two large sponsors. We have LaWanda Swope with Sotheby's International is another one of our large sponsors. And a few of the other ones that are here tonight, Ganton, hold your applause, I'm going to read 5 of them here. Ganton Fran Redmond, Honest Air Heating and Air Condition, FMK Financial Literacy, Lewis Hoffmeyer, and Ron L. Butler for Networking, Engineering, and Technology. So thank all of you for being here. Have a great evening, and we'll see you back here in 5 weeks. Thank you.